Good afternoon. Governor, have you had a chance to finish your lunch? Mrs. Bush, are you okay? Is it okay to begin? My boss, Munir Sadr, we're going to give it a shot. I can't tell you how excited we are. This absolutely, by most of our recollection, is one of the largest turnouts that CCGA has had for lunch. And given the fact that we are very much an apolitical organization and do the best we can to try to present both sides of the issue, and given the fact that this isn't even a candidate, this is a retired governor, we're wonderfully impressed. On behalf of CCGA, our sincerest thanks for your attendance, and I want to encourage, when the governor and Glenn get up here, that we have open discussion. Opportunity to meet the governor several months ago in a small group, and I walked away going, this is sort of the real deal. This was a group that is perceptive, asked questions, tough questions, and the governor handled it with great poise, with great compassion. But what really stood out for me was the strength of his values. And we look at the global chaos that we have and the confusion throughout Congress as to what's going on. I can't tell you how important it is to me and to my wife to have people in Washington that have strong family values, that have the ability to understand complex issues and have the discipline to make decisions that aren't always popular. I walked out of that breakfast and I'm going, here's someone that I'd be very, very proud to work for as hard as I can, and hope that should he choose to run, that in fact he will be successful. And with that, Governor Bush, would you please join us?
Thank you, Craig. Thank you very much. It is a joy to be here. I was expecting to have 100 people come. It's a little intimidating with all our friends from the press as well, but Kaluma and I are delighted to be here. Ambassador Dalder, thank you for the invite. Secretary Paulson, it's always good to see you. And many of my friends here in Chicago, it's a joy to be here. This shows our commitment, both my wife and I, our commitment to Illinois. When a Floridian leaves Florida in February. Thank you very much. I want to thank the members of the Chicago Council who have served in the military. Your service and the service of the men and women that are currently serving is an inspiration to all of us in the Bush family. My goal today is to explore how America can regain its leadership in the world and why that leadership is more necessary than ever. American leadership, projected consistently and grounded in principle, has been a benefit to the world. In the post-World War II era, the United States has helped hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, secured liberty for an equal number, and has been a force for peace and security. Only our exceptional country can make that claim. This has happened because our presidents, both Republican and Democrats, have accepted the responsibilities of American power in the world with the belief that we are a force for good. I have doubts whether this administration believes American power is such a force. Under this administration, we are inconsistent and indecisive. We have lost the trust and confidence of our friends. We definitely no longer inspire fear in our enemies. The problem is perhaps best demonstrated by this administration's approach to Iraq. We've had 35 years of experience with Iran. 35 years experience with Iran's rulers. They have attacked the United States and American troops directly and through their surrogates. They have used terror as a tool of intimidation. Today, 4 world capitals are now heavily influenced by Iran and its proxies: Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a. Iran's ambitions are clear, and its capabilities are growing. For many years, they have been developing long-range missile capabilities and their own nuclear weapon program. And during those years, America has opposed those efforts. Yet the Obama administration has launched negotiations in which the goal has shifted. The administration no longer seeks to prevent nuclear enrichment. Now it seeks merely to regulate it. Prevention of nuclear weapons in Iran was once a unifying issue in American foreign policy. Leaders of both parties agreed to it. When he launched his negotiations, President Obama said that that was the goal: stop Iran's nuclear program. Now we're told the goal has changed. And the point of these negotiations isn't to solve the problem, it's to manage it. Iran's intent is clear. Its leaders have openly expressed a call for the annihilation of the State of Israel. This is an existential threat to Israel and to the world, including the United States. We could face large-scale proliferation issues throughout the region if Iran has the ability to launch a nuclear weapon. Iran's neighbors will want their own nuclear capability because of this existential threat. No wonder some Democrats in Congress have lost confidence in this administration's efforts as it relates to Iran. Congress should pass bills to reinstate sanctions in advance if negotiations fail, and require approval of any agreement should one be reached. My hope is that this administration is able to rise to meet this defining foreign policy issue of our time. But so far, it appears that they're unequal to the task. And look elsewhere in the region, in the globe. Everywhere you look, you see the world slipping out of control. We see the rise of non-state terror organizations like ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda still growing in certain parts of the world. We see the breakdown of states like Iraq and Syria, the rise of tribalism and warfare of unspeakable brutality. The beheading of Egyptian Coptic Christians 2 days ago. The wiping out of millennia-old Christian communities in Iraq and Syria. The beheading of Americans, Japanese, and Europeans, all graphically displayed for us to watch on video. And the burning alive of a Jordanian pilot. Some of the worst violence is perpetrated by radical Muslims against other Muslims. We reset with Russia, then it invades and subverts its neighbors. We see the new threats of cyber warfare challenging our national security and our businesses. In Asia, territorial conflicts loom under the surface. The great irony of the Obama presidency is this: someone who came to office promising greater engagement with the world has left America less influential in the world. The work to restore America's leadership in the world will take a concerted effort, the commitment of new leaders, and a sure sense that America is often at its best when it's tested. The United States has an undiminished ability to shape events and build alliances of free people. We can project power and enforce peaceful stability in far-off areas of the globe. To do so, I believe we need to root our foreign policy in a set of priorities and principles. Of course, we must look to the challenges of specific regions and nations. Each situation will require its own approach, but we must not lose sight of the bigger picture. Today, I want to outline those principles which will make that possible and help America return to the responsibilities that come of being the world's leading power. I come to these issues with a great deal of thought and experience. One of my most formative experiences is when my wife, Kalum, and I, at the age of 24, accepted the responsibility of opening up a rep office in Texas Commerce Bank in Caracas, Venezuela. We had an 18-month-old, now George P. Bush, Land Commissioner George P. Bush, and Noel, and we went down there, and Caracas was this booming place, and we lived overseas. We lived outside of our beloved country. We learned how to use something that our parents used, diapers, because Pampers cost $1 a pamper, believe it or not, and I didn't make enough money at the time to be able to provide for that. That was okay, except we got water 1 hour like 3 times a day. And so while we had these personal challenges, which were exciting beyond belief, we also saw America from the outside. We saw Venezuela moving away from the United States as part of the so-called non-aligned nations movement. And I represented the bank in the Andean-packed countries, and many of them were pulling away as well. I lived overseas in the Carter era, where we saw firsthand what it was like to see the United States, this incredible country, lose respect of countries because of a weak and vacillating foreign policy. Later on, as governor, I had the chance to lead 15 trade missions And given Florida's footprint in the Western Hemisphere, I was actively involved in trade, immigration, and security issues in the region. We led the largest delegations, for example, of any state from the United States to Mexico, where 500 people participated, or Brazil, or Argentina. I have visited Israel 5 times. And in those meetings, I've had the incredible joy of seeing the spirit of Israel. On my highlight reel of life, whenever it's complete, I will have a trade agreement signed by the Secretary of Commerce of the state of Florida, Jeb Bush, and Ariel Sharon. It was one of the greatest joys of my life to do that. I've seen the extraordinary technology of our strongest ally in the region being able to create prosperity, turn Israel into a first world country. And if you go to Israel, as many of you I'm sure have, you see the incredible geography. Geography we take for granted here. Big countries with oceans as our borders have a totally different mentality than a country that is literally 10 miles away from countries all around the region, most of whom have never even accepted Israel's right to exist. Since leaving office as governor, I've had the chance to travel a lot more. In fact, I forced myself to go visit Asia 4 times a year to learn about the dynamic nature of the region. It's a long way from Miami. Asia is a dynamic region because it's modeled its rise on our American capitalist system and turned it into a uniquely Asian experience. And yet our allies in the region watch with anticipation because of a lack of consistent American engagement in that region as well, and the rise of the Chinese ambition. I've seen firsthand the difference of power of American commerce, American leadership, and American values. As you might know, I've also been fortunate to have a father and a brother who helped shape America's foreign policy from the Oval Office. I recognize that as a result, my views will often be held up in comparison to theirs. In fact, this is a great, fascinating thing in the political world for some reason. Sometimes in contrast to theirs. Look, just for the record, one more time, I love my brother. I love my dad. I actually love my mother as well. I hope that's okay. And I admire their service to the nation and the difficult decisions that they had to make. But I'm my own man, and my views are shaped by my own thinking and my own experiences. Each president learns from those who came before, their principles, their adjustments. One thing we know is this: every president inherits a changing world and changing circumstances. In the 1991 Gulf War timeframe, hardly anyone knew that the internet existed or who Al-Qaeda was. In 2003, at the beginning of the liberation of Iraq, neither Twitter nor ISIS existed. New circumstances require new approaches. So I want to share with you my own sense of the approaches that I think are necessary today. These are the principles I believe will be critical to put America back on the path of firm global leadership. First, America can't be a force for peace and security in the world if our economy doesn't grow over the long haul. Our aspiration should be 4% growth for as long as the eye can see. Imagine a country that would be growing at 4%. The middle would begin to see rising income. We would be significantly more optimistic about the future. Americans would think their children would have more opportunities again than what they had. And if we fix a few big complex things, we can do that. In fact, we're one of the only countries in the developed world that could make that assertion and execute on a plan to make that happen. The big things we need to fix is how we regulate, how we tax, how we get our fiscal house in order, of course, reforming a broken immigration system and turning it into a catalytic converter for sustained economic growth, how we transform our education system and how we make sure that we move our training programs into the 21st century. All of these things are important. Fixing our entitlement system, which will overwhelm all of the long-term spending that is so important to sustain economic growth, infrastructure, and research and development, will never be able to get back to the levels it needs to get for us to be competitive in the world unless we fix our entitlement problems over the long haul. We need to focus on trade and continue to make that a core principle of economic vitality in our country. Congress should give the President trade promotion authority as he completes the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Partnership and Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. The good news, as I said, is that we probably are the only country that could make this assertion, and if we were serious about it, become young and dynamic and emerging again. Whoever created the terminology of BRIC would have to change the name, because the United States would be in that category if we got this right. And our role and confidence then of being a power for peace and security would be sustained over the long haul. One other thing about our economic progress that directly ties to foreign policy, in our midst today is an energy revolution that is perhaps the most exciting news that we have. It is possible for America to be energy secure with North American resources in relatively short order. If we created a strategy around this, we would create economic activity and hundreds of billions of dollars investment in our own country, but we'd also have the lowest cost source of energy for consumers, the lowest cost source of energy to reindustrialize the country, and play a significant role in dealing with countries that use their oil for blackmail, for political purposes. As we grow our presence by growing our ability to produce oil and gas, we also make it possible to lessen the dependency that Russia now has on top of Europe, and lessen the dependency of other countries, and lessen their economic might, whether it's Venezuela, Iran, or Russia, by focusing on this economic strategy, modernizing the oil economy of Mexico, making sure that we don't stifle the energy revolution in our own country, and coordinating all of this with our strongest trading partner, Canada, will yield an economic powerhouse in this region that could compete with any region in the world. One final point about economic growth: free people, free markets, free ideas, implemented faithfully, will set a powerful example of what's possible to the rest of the world. As people lose confidence around the world of capitalism and the democracy that underpins capitalism, they move in different directions. If they see America at its best, growing with a tremendous prosperity, they will emulate that system, and that'll bring about a more peaceful world. The second principle that I believe in is that our words and actions must match, so that the entire world knows that we say what we mean and mean what we say. There should be no gap there. This administration talks, but the words fade. They draw red lines and then erase them. With grandiosity, they announce resets and then disengage. Hashtag campaigns replace actual diplomacy and engagement. Personal diplomacy and maturity is replaced by leaks and personal disparagement. The examples keep piling up. President Obama called ISIS the junior varsity 4 days after they took Fallujah, and when they comprised a fighting force of more than 200,000 battle-tested men. President Obama dismissed Russia as merely a regional power 1 month after they fomented and participated actively in the violent takeover of eastern Ukraine. And his administration has lobbed leaks and personal insults to Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet with incredible regularity. In all of these actions, we see a careless disregard to the long-term interests of America in the world. Instead, what we see is an effort to try to win the political news cycle. I want to take a moment to talk about the controversy surrounding Bibi Netanyahu's joint session speech to Congress that's coming up in the first week of March. I, for one, am really eager to hear what he has to say. Israel is not at the negotiation table with Iran, but it has a lot at stake. I don't blame him for wanting to share his views, and in fact, I think it will be important for the American people to get the perspective of our closest ally in the region. I'm surprised that the administration is upset to hear from a close and valuable ally on such a sensitive topic. If we want to build confidence and trust of the American position, we have to listen. Foreign policy should be a place where our long-term security interests are front and center, and the political hacks should be doing the campaigns and staying there. We should strive to make it bipartisan again. A president needs to set a strategy, to be clear about it, not overcommit or overpromise, but always strive to deliver. The third principle is that the president's word needs to be backed up by the greatest military force in the world. I grew up politically, I guess, in the 80s, where I got to watch Ronald Reagan and my dad with incredible people serving by their side in a bipartisan fashion, I might add, And the slogan that I think drove the foreign policy of the 80s was peace through strength. And military power must be rebuilt. To provide for the common defense is a primary duty of government under the Constitution. Due to budget cuts and sequester because of the dysfunction in Washington, we're on the path of only spending 2.5% of GDP on defense by the end of this decade. This is really dangerous. The president should call on leaders of both parties to fix the budget and to address the shortfalls in our defense spending. He should show leadership and a commitment to solving this problem. And the next president should launch a strategic review of our military strategy so that we meet 21st century needs with a 21st century defense capability. Then we should fund that strategy rather than the other way around. Our military is not a discretionary expense. It is an essential asset to keep the homeland safe and for the world to be a more secure place. After all, the use of military power is one of the most serious decisions a president has to make. Having a military that is equal to any threat is not only essential for the commander-in-chief, it also makes it less likely that we'll need to put our men and women in uniform in harm's way. Because I believe, fundamentally, weakness invites war. Strength encourages peace. The fourth principle is an engaged America that needs to strengthen the alliances and relationships that foster security in the world. In the post-World War II era, we've relied on these alliances in ways that have been understated perhaps for the American people, but they have been a huge part of the reason why there has been a peaceful world where people have had a chance to rise up. And America, again, needs to lead, and we can't do it alone. We need to strengthen NATO, our relationship with Asian and Pacific allies like Japan and Korea and Australia, as well as the ASEAN countries, and rebuild stronger ties, as I've mentioned, in our own neighborhood, particularly with Mexico and Canada. We have to rebuild our relationships with allies and key relationships in the Middle East, including the Persian Gulf states and, of course, Egypt. We will not be successful unless we invest in the much-needed coalitions and partnerships and develop the personal relationships that make it possible to garner worldwide support for the great threats that we face today, most particularly radical Islamic terrorism around the world. Ultimately, the goal should be this: others should want America as a friend. There should be no comfort, no success, and no future standing against the United States in alliance with people that believe in freedom. Fifth, while certain nations will always seek to challenge our country, we must be prepared to address the new asymmetric, non-state-sponsored threats that now kind of consume the news, but more importantly have emerged as perhaps the greatest security threat that we now face for our own homeland. These threats, as we see, come nearly every day. They come in the form of some of the most evil and horrific, barbaric acts on innocent life. Passengers on a airplane or a subway, office workers, shoppers at a kosher market, or congregates at a synagogue, children at a school, cartoonists at their drafting tables, or Christians simply practicing their faith. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Taliban, and others set their sights on the softest of targets, exploiting the freedoms of the West to attack Western life. We must be prepared for a long-term commitment to fight this battle. These attacks require a response on many levels, but most of all, we should focus on preventing them. That requires responsible intelligence gathering and analysis, including the NSA metadata program, which contributes to awareness of potential terror cells and interdiction efforts on a global scale. For the life of me, I don't understand the debate has gotten off track where we're not understanding and protecting. We do protect our civil liberties, but this is a hugely important program to use these technologies to keep us safe. It requires close coordination with allies and a rigorous homeland effort, including border security. The threats of the 21st century will not be the same as the threats of the 20th, and it is critical that we adapt to this challenge. Finally, I believe our foreign policy must be rooted in a critical principle. Let's call it liberty diplomacy. America at its founding declared that the power in our country rested with the individual and not the other way around, and that individual's liberty was natural and self-evident. We enshrined the idea of free speech, a free press, free markets, and the inalienable right of religious freedom. America's experience affirms the power of human liberty, not just because America has thrived, but because the world has thrived from it as well. I think of the example of Dr. Ho Wang Lee of Korea. In the midst of the Korean War in the 1950s, he fled the North to fight alongside American troops for the South. When the war was concluded, he studied medicine and set his life to the exploration of human disease and cures, and he succeeded. His work led him to identify and isolate hantavirus and then develop a vaccine for the disease. America's defense of Korea was not without sacrifice. The war, some historians say, ended in a draw. But don't tell that to Dr. Lee, and don't tell that to the millions of Koreans whose freedom is assured because of America's commitment even today. In 60 years, Korea has gone from perhaps the most desolate, poorest country on the face of the earth to being a first world country with no illiteracy rate and rising income and world-class businesses that have embraced Korean technologies to make them global competitors. Look, the stakes could not be clearer. And for those who doubt me, just consider the testimony of the very few people who escaped the modern concentration camps of North Korea. Our commitment to Korea will bear fruit for generations. In Dr. Lee's work, the lives he's saved, and the potential of millions like him all over the world. In Europe, in Africa, in Asia, tens of millions of people can tell their own story of American goodness, of a life saved, of a life liberated, of a life of freedom. Because America chose to lead, America chose to sacrifice, and America chose to be freedom's greatest defender. We do this work for others, and we also do it for ourselves. Because time and time again, we have learned that if we withdraw from the defense of liberty elsewhere, the battle eventually comes to us anyway. In our cities, in our streets, and in our skies. The enemies of freedom will never be content to live in their own dark corner of the globe. They must eventually strike out at America, and they often do. America does not have the luxury of withdrawing from the world. Our security and our prosperity and our values demand that we remain engaged and involved in often distant places. We have no reason to apologize for our leadership or our interest in serving the cause of global security, global peace, and human freedom. Nothing and no one can replace strong American leadership. Thank you all very much. I appreciate the chance to be here. There you are. Thank you.
There you go, Governor. You're right there.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I know everybody in the room appreciates the breadth and the depth of your remarks. And you took us on a principled world tour. So let's start a little closer to home.
Okay.
Let's start with the reset in Cuba. And the rationale for the reset being we have 50 years of failed policy, and it is time for a fresh approach because the previous policies spanning that extraordinary period of time have not worked. And we are going to establish a relationship with the country that is still governed by the Castros. If you were president, what would your perspective be?
Well, I wouldn't call what we did a reset because I would call it bad negotiations to start with because we got nothing in return. We traded a guy who was held hostage, Alan Gross, an AID worker, for no reason. He was allowed in the country. He was held hostage. He was languishing in prison, and in fact, his wife believed that if he stayed much longer, he was going to die, for spies that were convicted in our American judicial system. That was not an equal trade. We opened up additional amounts of travel, so many of you may have gone as, like I say in quotes, education trips, and now those have been expanded. The president has that authority to do so, and nothing in return. And so all of that money There are two sources for the Castro regime of any importance. One is the subsidized oil they get from Venezuela, and the other is American tourists that come, Cuban Americans and Americans, to the tune of about 750,000, I believe. And all of that hard currency goes to the coffers to support the regime. And so the notion that somehow you're going to have freedom just kind of outbreak in Cuba, I think is false. I think it's incorrect. Is it important to engage the Cubans and say what our expectations are for a change in policy? Sure, I think that's more than appropriate. But to do this secretly, without any consultation with Congress, and to do so without anything in return, we're already beginning to see what the results of those are. The first formal talks, basically, not dissimilar to what's going on in the Iranian deal, the Cubans began to renegotiate what their expectations are and ask for more and more in return as they negate the ability to do anything that would create a trade-off. So I think it was the wrong thing to do. Had they waited, had the administration, if they were serious about creating the climate for a free Cuba, had they waited, they would have seen significant economic strains that would have probably brought Cuba to the table, because $45 oil in Venezuela is creating a close to failed state. And if Venezuela collapses, the first thing that happens is they're going to have to pull back from the Petrocaribe program that they have, which subsidizes significantly the Cuban regime. And Cuba would probably have to pull back on the number of state security forces that are in Venezuela to prop up the regime as well. A little bit of patience, I think, would have yielded a better result.
So let's stay in Latin America just as a reference point for your principled address and the application of the principles of freedom and democracy and economic growth, and the extent to which success, not only in the United States, but also economic success relative to our allies, makes them strong, worthy allies.
Absolutely.
What is it that you think creates such difficulty for Latin America to gain its footing economically and politically?
Well, first of all, I would say there's half of Latin America has embraced freedom as it relates to consistency of the rule of law, allowing for a thriving civil society, of creating better economic conditions so people can rise up. Commitments that many of these countries have made. We've seen significant gains of people that were completely isolated and now are moving out of the abject poverty that is important for a country to succeed. So you can look at the countries that have made these reforms and you see significant economic growth. Chile, Colombia, Mexico to a certain extent. These are the countries that are in their ascendancy, and the countries that have embraced crony capitalism or state-dominated socialism are the ones that are having problems. It's a reminder of the obvious, which is that the proper implementation of free market capitalism, providing opportunities for people, is the best system ever created. And the United States has pulled back from the region, and those voids are now being filled by new actors, most particularly China, that is seeking resources, not necessarily inspired by little L liberalism. And I think our withdrawal from the region is not appropriate. We could create, I think the focus ultimately needs to get back to a free trade agreement of the Americas, where the United States would benefit. Now, I selfishly say that because if you just go back home today and look at a map, and where Klum and I live is going to be right at the center of the universe of that free trade agreement. But nevertheless, there's huge opportunities there. And I'll give you another example where engagement by the United States in the region has been a spectacular success. And that is Proyecto Plan Colombia, the Plan Colombia that was, I don't know what they call it in English actually, Coming Plan, I guess. It was.
I think that's it.
It was an effort. Sometimes my mind switches and I apologize. So this was a plan to deal with the dramatic social turmoil in Colombia where the drug cartel and the violence was significant. In the previous administration, they made a significant effort to provide technical support, military support, economic support. President Uribe made a real commitment to open up the economy, to allow people to liberate the economy so that there'd be more economic opportunity, and it was a huge victory. We should apply that same type of approach right now, and the president has actually proposed, I haven't seen the details of it, for the Northern Triangle states in Central America, which has a very similar kind of situation, perhaps even more grave. And that is the drug cartels and the gangs in these countries make it harder for people to consider investing there. And so the middle is getting squeezed, and the poor feel dislocated from the rest of society. And so a similar kind of approach there, that's the proper role for the United States, I think, to play. And that's a bipartisan support. That, during my brother's administration, that received significant support from both sides of Congress. And my guess is that if the president's serious about this and advocates this and goes to Congress, he'll get support as well.
So Governor, if we stay with your principles and we move across the Atlantic and we think in context of economic growth, robust allies.
Now we're getting in trouble.
Well, we would need them to be. We would need them to be economically robust. We would need them to share our values, our ideals. We would need a sense of cohesion in what you said today and what they believe to confront circumstances such as Russia, Ukraine. How do you think about the relative strength of NATO, of the alliance, of the great democracies in confronting this threat?
So what I believe to be true is that the more tepid the economic growth and the belief that the growth will stay that way, the more pessimistic people are about making the long-term commitments to defend themselves even, or to defend themselves through an alliance that has been extraordinarily successful. If you consider NATO's long life, it's been a significant force for good in the world. But as people in most of Europe now see the world, they see it deeply pessimistic about their future and their children's future. And so I think we need to, and frankly, it's directly related to our own country as well. We have this similar kind of feeling, less so than perhaps Europe, but it's a significant challenge for us. And that's why I think growth first, growth above all else, has really got to be the strategy for the next president of the United States and for opinion leaders in this country, because that will create optimism that allows for looking over the horizon and thinking longer term. And there's really not been a country in the post-crash era that has made the significant adjustments to be able to create sustained economic growth in the developed world. Japan has gotten relatively close, but they had, what, 3 arrows, the 2 arrows of the easiest, massive stimulation by their central bank and one other they did. The hard one, which is adjusting their entitlement system or whatever they call that, the social contract, hasn't happened. Europe has the exact same challenge. UK, I think, gets credit for making some adjustments, and in fact, ironically, they're the one country that has really had an increase in economic growth over the last year. But no country, including ours, has really come to grips with this, and that's the big challenge. I think we're going to see a hollowed core in Europe unless we begin to see strategies to create high sustained economic growth again. And the demography of these countries is, including ours, is one of the big challenges, which is why immigration reform for our country is so hugely important, because we don't have, race is not a national identifier in this country. We're 34 flavors. We are as diverse can get, and that is a huge strength looking over the horizon right now, where multiculturalism kind of creates pockets of despair in Europe in many cases. The United States has this potential of being young and dynamic again. If Europe embraced that similar kind of approach, I think that they could see economic growth as well. And if it doesn't happen, I think you're going to see NATO being a place where maybe there's a lot of conversation going on, but I don't think it's going to be a force that's going to intimidate anybody, and that the treaty obligation of helping any of the fellow NATO members will look hollow as well. And the minute that happens, you create you create real uncertainty that could lead to miscalculations by people in the region.
So in the backdrop of that discussion of the European Union, European democracies, and NATO itself, what's your sense of what we should be discussing with respect to our perspective
Right.
of Mr. Putin and the Germans and other European democracies who don't have the benefit of the oceans that you described?
No, they don't.
And he's proximate to them. He's physically proximate.
Plus, they have centuries of war, and so they have a different attitude about all this for sure. If we don't, I think the first step for the United States is recommit to rebuilding our own military and making a commitment that we're committed to do this because we want to rebuild NATO and for other obvious reasons. That it's very hard for us to go lecture Europe about their declining commitment to their own defense capabilities when we're doing the same thing. So I think the first step is to show leadership. The second is to give the Europeans a sense that we're not disengaging, we're not pulling back, we're not moving to Fortress America, that we're in this for the long haul, for our own interests, but also for the interests of global security. And then I think we have to engage with the Germans particularly because they are obviously the most important power in Europe, and other countries as well, to say that we have their back, that we're going to be in this over the long haul. The second thing I'd say as it relates to Putin, and the president did this, I don't know what the effect has been because it's really kind of hard to be out on the road, and I'm just a gladiator these days, so I don't follow every little detail, but the president did make a commitment to forward lean in the Baltic states, and I think that's the appropriate thing to do. It doesn't have to be a permanent base, but to show a commitment that we're serious about the NATO alliance is important. I don't know how that's been implemented. The worst thing would have been to announce it and not do it, so I'm assuming that it has been implemented. And I would suggest another thing as it relates to Europe and Putin, rather than react to each egregious act that Putin has shown, which he does on a regular basis because there is no price, in effect, in his world, there needs to be a higher price. He is a pragmatic man. He's a ruthless pragmatist, but he's pragmatic. And there is a calculation on each one of these actions that if the cost is too high for Russia, it will create a deterrent effect. And so I think we ought to have rather than react to each action, we ought to state what those costs will be as it relates to sanctions, as it relates to isolating Russia in the neighborhood and other things like that. And then finally, I would suggest that the Ukraine is not immediately in our national interest, as I would say, it's not in our neighborhood per se, but Ukraine is an important country in a lot of ways, and to ignore their request for defensive military support when they're being invaded, because that's what's happened, just seems feckless. I mean, I know that's the European side of this temporarily at least, but the United States should lead in this regard as well. And then you create a better climate for perhaps pushing Russia back a little bit, and they have structural problems as well. I mean, every one of these countries has long-term economic challenges that could play out if we were more patient. $45, $50 barrel oil is not good news for Vladimir Putin.
Let's talk a little bit about another tough neighborhood and move from Europe to the Middle East.
Oh, man. And is there a good neighborhood we can go to just temporarily?
You're in one.
Good point.
Thank you. It's hard to know where to start, but let's take freedom and democracy and the Arab Spring and what has to now historically be perceived as a misjudgment as to what would ensue following the Arab Spring from Egypt to Tunisia.
Actually, Tunisia has worked out.
Right.
Pretty good.
We would be remiss to celebrate Tunisia and move on, right? But Whether,
Just tip a hat to him. At least.
yeah, that's good. Whether or not the Saudis become a Western-style democracy anytime soon, in that neighborhood, it has historically been true that you take your friends and your allies rather as they come and understand that you have alignments of a different sort strategically. We got away from that a bit, I would suggest, in Egypt, and it has resulted in a bit of a confused state as to who it is we would actually wish were there. We don't have the strong Egypt that we once had, which created a significant buffer to Iran. What's your sense of how we harmonize our ideological views relative to Western-style democracy or any form of democracy and freedom, and having a secure ally that thinks differently than we do?
This is your best question so far.
It may be my best period.
No, this is a question that I think we need to think about a lot, because foreign policy is not about just one thing. It's about, yes, I mean, I do believe that American values and American liberty is a force for good in the world, that if we could create the freest world, that we would have less threats, less violence, less terrorism, and many other things. But to get there, that's a long-term challenge, and it's different in every country. So I would say that we got it wrong in Egypt. We got it wrong 3 times, literally in a couple of years. It was we were late to the game and we kept missing it, and now we're pulling back from providing support for al-Sisi, who is the one. If you think about it, the guy, I don't know if you saw this about a month ago. He gave this incredible speech about Muslim extremism and saying that it's the responsibility of the Arab world to step up to fight this. That the first risks are for countries like Egypt. And is he a little L liberal Democrat that believes in freedom like we do? No, he isn't. But I think we have to be practical. We have to balance our belief in liberty with a belief that security and engagement will create the possibilities for the Egyptians to garner more freedom. If we pull back and we're diffident about this and just kind of pull back and say, well, you know, you're not on our team, we get the result we've seen, which is Egypt going it alone. Egypt welcoming Vladimir Putin to Cairo, which they did last week. 1973, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, in a brilliant stroke of foreign policy, pulled Sadat into the Western world. And the Soviets were kicked out of the region, literally. Now we're seeing Russia being invited back in because of our disengagement. And so I think the lesson learned here is that there has to be a balance. The other, and this is not just, by the way, I've been critical of the president a lot here. This is a problem of presidents past as well, in all honesty, that we view. If you have an election, you're a democracy. Chavez had an election, and he used it to steal freedom in Venezuela. Hamas had an election. Hezbollah competes. These groups are not supportive of democracy. They use the election process to take away freedom from people. And we consistently, in American foreign policy, think that just check the box and it's okay. That's not how democracy works. And so I think we have to assess that as well. And in the case of Egypt, they can play a constructive role right now, and we should be engaging with them. We shouldn't have, trip ourselves over to the Turks and the Qataris when the Egyptians had a better ceasefire that could have brought about a more lasting peace between the fight in Gaza. We consistently are disrespecting the allies that make a huge difference in the region, and I think we have to, rearrange that again.
You spoke in your speech to having been in an extraordinary vantage point in your life, to be among your father and his close circle of advisors, and then your brother and his close circle of advisors, and the quality of service that so many of those people are viewed to have contributed to those years. There's a perception that the same quality, even if you use sort of an ad hominem point of comparison, no longer exists. Do you think that that's true, or we just look in the rearview mirror with a
No, I don't think it's true.
Are they rose tinted?
I don't think it's true. I think it's we're much more pessimistic these days. So we see things and always view it in the negative. It's time for us to get off. I feel like I should be the marine psychologist in the Geico ad. Where he throws the Kleenex at the poor guy who's like, get over it, man. This is the greatest country on the face of the earth. We shouldn't be as pessimistic as we are, because we're on the verge of the greatest time to be alive. That's my attitude about this stuff, and if you think that way, look, the president's had talented people around him. What he hasn't done is empowered them to do their jobs. He has taken away power from the departments that are responsible for defending the homeland and protecting, creating the military strategy and our foreign policy strategy. It's become more politicized and it's become more centralized in the White House. And I think that was a mistake. But the talent is there. Now, granted, you think about the people that served in previous administrations. There was you had Henry Kissinger, Schultz, and Madeleine Albright all testifying at a committee hearing last week, the Foreign Affairs Committee. I grant you, these are incredibly talented people, but we have those people. This country has that kind of talent, and I'm not worried about that at all. We're in our ascendancy as a nation. We just have to start acting like it again.
So the new Bush cabinet would have no difficulty if it, so.
That's a 15-yard penalty and loss of down.
So that wasn't my best question, right? We could, I think one could easily conclude that a discussion of sovereign states, the way that we have been proceeding here, is much easier than a discussion of this ISIS phenomena. And you mentioned it in your speech. What to make of this? A stateless entity seeks to be a state, carving out territory to incorporate it into an image of what they perceive to be a caliphate. What type of diplomacy do you apply here?
No diplomacy. With them directly? No, that's not. We have to develop a strategy that's global, that takes them out. First, the strategy needs to be restrain them, tighten the noose, and then taking them out is the strategy. There's no talking about this. That's just not going to work for terrorism, and it has to be done in concert with first the folks in the region. You look at Jordan. Jordan's population has grown, I think, double digits with refugees from Syria. They have refugees from Iraq. They have refugees from previous wars with Israel. Palestinians are there. This country is a powder keg. Similarly, other countries in the region are seeing real challenges, whether it's Turkey or the Persian Gulf states or the Saudis that have an estimated, close to 1,000 Saudi citizens that are fighters for ISIS. These are big security threats in the region, and we need to create a coalition led by the United States, because only the United States could lead something this, but in total concert with the neighborhood. And it's made more complicated by our pullback, because there's no trust right now. The United States is serious about this. The minute there's a problem, the feeling is that we're going to cut and run. And then you add on top of that the Shia-Sunni issue, and this gets really, really complicated. So the president's got a huge challenge here. Part of it's his own making. Part of it are these trends that have existed for a long while. But we have to be engaged in this, because if we think that somehow this is just going to be contained in a particular part of geography in Iraq and Syria, that it has no impact on us, which some Americans believe, that there will be a day where there will be a big awakening, unfortunately, because that's not the way it is.
So ISIS, Governor, allows us, through their barbarism, to think of them in that context as a horrific criminal element.
Yeah, I would
What
say
do you
it's
think
more,
about what do you think about tribalism? You certainly handle that one, but beyond that, what about the dissolution of sovereign states in the Middle East and a return to tribalism?
Well, I think that would be horrific, to be honest with you. But more horrific is to not horrific, but I think it's a mistake to think that ISIS is not what it is, and it's violent, extreme Islamic terrorism. And the more we try to ignore that reality, the less likely it is that we're going to develop the appropriate strategy to garner the support in the Muslim world to do what I said, which is tighten the noose and then take them out. And it's important. I think people in our country, including the president, struggle with this. They have a hard time accepting what it is. I think our strategy would be more incisive if we accepted what it is. It relates to the breakdown of the nation states. I don't have a solution to that. I mean, I've read articles, about whatever the 1915 kind of breakout of the Middle East and how that no longer is a viable deal. I'd like to know what the alternative is before we just kind of discard nation-state status in a significantly important part of the world, to be honest with you.
Well, we see, what I meant to say is ISIS at least allows, through its barbaric acts, you to define them as you did. Boko Haram and the others throughout, whether it be Africa or maybe less so, but it seems to be a phenomenon that's taking place inside of states, don't honor the sovereignty of the states that within which they reside. How do you establish a dialogue with such a phenomenon?
Well, let's go to Iraq. There were mistakes made in Iraq for sure. Using the intelligence capability that everybody embraced about weapons of mass destruction turns out not to be accurate. Not creating an environment of security after the successful taking out of Hussein was a mistake, because Iraqis wanted security more than anything else. But my brother's administration, through the surge, which was one of the most heroic acts of courage politically that any president's done, because there was no support for this, and it was hugely successful, and it created a stability that when the new president came in, he could have built on to create a fragile but more stable situation that would have not allowed for the void to be filled. The void has been filled because we created the void. And so the lesson, I think, is engagement. Whether it's always the United States, that's another subject. I don't think it has to be. But when you have a failed state or a weak state and you leave, the first things that happened was Maliki turned to, because it was fragile, who did he turn to? He turned to Iran. And Iran's influence now has replaced the United States in a significant way. And so if you're serious about protecting the status of nation states, you have to be able to protect that integrity. The void, ISIS didn't exist 3 or 4 years ago. In fact, the guy that's the supreme leader, whatever his new title is, head of the caliphate, he was in a prison in southern Iraq.
Right. Okay, with that, we have 15 minutes to go before our hard stop, and I have no doubt but that the governor's speech and his answers to my questions have provoked...
Brilliant questions.
Except for the one. Have provoked questions in the audience. Please raise your hand and we will get to you promptly, but you have to wait for the microphone so that, Bill, that'd be, we'll get to you, Bill. Let me go. How about this one right here? Can we get a microphone right there for that hand? It's it. Thank you, madam.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. My name is Professor Bernadette Atuahene. I'm interested in the comment you made about Cuba, about our recent engagement with Cuba. You said patience would have yielded a better result. And that just struck me as strange because we've been patient for half a century in terms of our policy towards Cuba. The embargo has been going on since the 60s.
Yep.
And it sounded to me like you were saying the catalyst is going to be, the oil prices and Venezuela's changed position, when in fact we know the collapse of the Soviet Union didn't do it. So why do we have cause to think that the change in the oil prices in Venezuela is going to do it? And so I'm just wondering, why not have the courage to say this has been a failed policy for over half a century. We need to do something new and different. A policy of engagement like we have pursued with China, right? Another undemocratic country that we are trying to move towards democracy. So if you could just talk a little bit more about your Cuba politics.
Absolutely, not politics, policy. Absolutely. First of all, the embargo can't be lifted unilaterally by the president. It has to be lifted by change in law in Congress. So the president can only tinker around the margins on this, and strangely enough, there's very little support for lifting the embargo, and many of the leaders in the Democratic Party that are engaged in this subject are opposed to that as well. What I'm saying is that if the objective is freedom in Cuba, if that was the objective of this negotiation, and I hope it was. I hope that, because that's a legitimate aspiration and a legitimate role for the president to play, then what he did prolongs the regime's existence. It doesn't shorten the existence. It's similar in one level with the negotiations that people's interpretations of the negotiations in Iran, that there's a feeling that somehow if we don't put too many conditions on our negotiations, that they'll end up being a democracy over time, that the repression will subside. But you have to create the environment where that happens. And in the case of Cuba, no one honestly believes that this is just going to happen by osmosis. Let's just say, well, let's just say that the embargo didn't work, so let's just lift the embargo, lift everything. Very few people, at least, there's some, and maybe you and I disagree on this. I don't think it happens unless you negotiate it in a way that creates the conditions for it to happen. And the Venezuelan point is this. Venezuela replaced Russia, well, first the Soviets, then Russia, as the main provider of aid to Cuba. And Cuba's lived on 5 or 6 lives here by being patient. If the objective was freedom for Cuba, putting some pressure on the fact that Venezuela's support for Cuba is going to subside and not opening up our piggy banks for it to happen, 90%, 95% of which those hard currency dollars are going to go to support the regime, not for the Cuban people, that I thought it was a mistake.
There's the basis for a robust discussion. Bill, how about you? Question? Right here.
Governor, first, thank you for your comments. And I want to focus on one of your principles with which I very much agree, and that is that economic strength can lead to political strength. Now, if we take that and then rotate to Asia, let's talk about China for a second. Second largest economy in the world, soon to be the largest economy in the world, growing at 7%. There's no question they've taken that growing economic strength to try to project political strength, including trying to redefine what sovereign territory is, for example, in the South China Sea, whether it's Vietnam, the Philippines, or Japan. The president talks a lot about a pivot to Asia, but has done very little. What should we be doing differently to really preserve the strength of our allies, whether it's in ASEAN or elsewhere in Asia?
Well, I think the term pivot was probably a mistake because two problems with that. Pivots are in the eyes of the beholder, right? So in Asia, people they don't see the pivot. And in fact, in my travels there, people would always say consistently, you guys only talk about the pivot when you're in our region. You don't talk about the pivot when you're like back in Washington. And it's an important point that people, if they don't perceive this to be a serious move, then it doesn't achieve the desired result. And secondly, pivots imply that you're leaving some other place. And so the rest of the world wonders, am I the pivotee? Am I what's going to happen there? So I think the language was wrong. The intent to try to re-engage in Asia, I think, is the right one. But it has to be real, and it can't just be talked about. It has to be real. So, and I would add, this is in front of Secretary Paulson, who's probably the leading voice on this in the United States, that engagement with China is equally important. That we got to create confidence with our traditional allies, Japan and Korea, Australia for sure. but we also have to have a ongoing, deep relationship with China. Back to the point, I forgot one point about the Cuba deal, if I could. When we negotiated relations with China, we got significant benefits from that in our own national security. We created a relationship that then became a buffer against the Soviet Union. When we negotiated diplomatic relations and an opening in Vietnam, we got the return of the list of POWs. We got something in return. And so I think just from a negotiating point of view, this was poorly handled as it relates to Cuba. But China, we have to stay engaged because my experience, and it pales by comparison to many in this room, I'm sure, but my experience is it's so easy to create misunderstandings. That we could easily go from being a competitor economically to being challenged in terms of security if we don't stay engaged at every level. It's the most complex, going forward, perhaps the most complex, important relationship that the United States has.
Right here, please. Coming your way, right there behind you. See there?
Governor, thank you very much. We live in a city where 2 miles south of here, babies born black have a much shorter lifespan and expectancy than a mile north of here. What can we do differently in the new White House?
The question of the stickiness of poverty is a huge challenge for this country, not just in Chicago, but around the country. And I think you start with the realization that the world we're moving towards, that baby brought into the world today, born, first of all, he's going to be, or she's going to be really cold, just. But that precious little child, if he or she is born in the wrong zip code, it's possible, unless there's some kind of life-altering change in their course, will never have a job. Because the world we're moving towards is dramatic increases in innovation, creating exponential increases in automation, are making more and more jobs when that child grows up more obsolete. And the ability to live a life independently, a life of purpose and meaning, is going to be altered in many ways. And so this is a huge challenge, and I think our policies have worked to provide material benefits for people in poverty. They haven't worked to lift them out. They haven't worked to help them have the capacity to achieve earned success. And so put aside who the president is, because this is not necessarily exclusively a White House issue or a federal government issue. As a society, we have to build capacity for people to achieve earned success. And that goes beyond, transfer payments. That goes to how do you love a child with your heart and soul, where you learn the habits that ultimately yield success. How do you teach people, young people, grit and determination? And then how do you give them the tools with a better education, a much better education, a radically different education, so that they can dream bigger dreams and not feel so disengaged that they don't even try? It's a huge problem, and the health issues, I think, are actually easier than the issues that I'm bringing up here of the permanency of poverty today. If you're born poor in America today, you're more likely to stay poor than any time in modern economic history. Of this time of enormous affluence, that should concern everybody. And if you're born rich, by the way, you and your families, this is the greatest time to be alive, and you're more likely to stay rich. We're sticky at the ends, and the middle's getting squeezed. And our politics doesn't seem really focused on how to address these issues yet. That's work in progress for sure. It's a great question.
Thank you for that. One we have time for right here in front of me, just here, gentleman right here. You, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Bush, just to play devil's advocate, if Iran wanted a nuclear weapon, why couldn't they just go to one of the bad boys in the neighborhood, like North Korea, Pakistan, or Russia, where allegedly there are a couple of hundred nukes missing when the USSR collapsed? It's an argument that's also being used for proliferation, like, well, then the Saudis will go and buy one too.
Yeah.
And if you bought a weapon that's made already, it's A, tried and tested. After all, you're not going to risk 2,500 years of civilization on a dud. And secondly, you can hide it more easily. You don't have to hide them under mountains and so forth.
Yeah. I don't think that's a devil's advocate question. That's a scary question that also, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not either or. I don't know if you followed the story of A.Q. Khan, the Pakistani nuclear scientist who stole technologies from Europe, brought it back. He's a national hero in Pakistan. He lives, you know, out in the open. He created the capacity to do just as you're describing in Pakistan, and was caught trying to export that technology to where? Iran and to Libya. And so what you're describing isn't, you know, something, why would they do it? They've tried. They absolutely have tried. And the idea that other nations aren't trying to do this is, look, we got to be real about this. They are trying. And this is why engagement in the treaty and the proliferation efforts that are global and ongoing to make sure that we retard any efforts in that regard are hugely important. And so, look, this is the more I get into this stuff, there's some things you just go, you know, holy shnikes. I mean, this is like serious stuff. And we cannot be, it just makes me more committed to an America that is fully engaged in the world. Because as the rest of the world gets weak and more insular in their thinking because of their economic conditions, we have to be engaged. Because these things will occur. And there are other threats as well, but this one is probably the biggest in the globe right now. It's a great question.
It is, and it's going to have to be the last one. Governor, we in Chicago and at the council hugely appreciate your time and the opportunity to take your principles from your remarks and to have a conversation with all of us around those principles. And we're truly pleased to have been privileged to have the opportunity to do so. Thanks for coming to Chicago.
Thank you all very much.
That's great.
Well done.
Thank you. Well done. Enjoyed it very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Somebody get my wife?